So many thanks to both of our speakers, Professor Goldberg and Professor Ballybor. And we can open up the floor right now to questions if anybody has them.
So, and actually really don't really have a question here, but there was a lot that both of you said, and obviously there's quite a bit of overlapping. But in terms of this notion of a racism without racisms, was it racisms in plural or was it singular?
Racisms without racism.
Racisms without racism? Okay. Anyway, so this post-racial, part of the way it all, I think I got a little confused at some point because from Professor Bellibor's talk, there was quite a bit that you talked about in terms of this racism that hides itself, this racism that disavows itself, as you did as well. But you were talking about I couldn't tell if it was what you were proposing, but post-racial as in post-colonial, as the haunting of. I couldn't figure out if that was a symptomatic reading or it was sort of a reappropriation of the term, or I wasn't quite sure how you were deploying it.
Yeah, both really wonderful talks. The image that came to me after both of your talks was Michelle Bachmann, when she, she was a Tea Party responder, and she said something to the effect of, the founding fathers have been working, since the beginning to end slavery or something like that. So, I mean, it's a kind of statement which makes me think about the genealogical, inverse, backward flips of how, on the one hand, you deny, you enact a denial of the denial, but on the other hand, you sort of prop up the founding fathers, this kind of genealogical fiction. So I would be really interested to hear you talk about that.
Actually, I can ask a second question having to do with the genealogical. You referred to notions of citizenship, and yes, Professor Ballybor, you referred to that there were certain things, categories such as citizenship and rights, that you referred to as anti-genealogical or agenealogical, I'm not sure which one. And I guess I'd like to hear a little bit about in what sense it is agenealogical, and I'm sure you disrupted it somewhere in your talk, but I didn't quite follow if you did or not. So in what sense they don't, I assume you addressed the connection to the family and the reproductions of sort of psychic genealogies in addition to just biological ones. So if you could just talk more about the agenealogical, how it's agenealogical.
Yeah, I understood Professor Ballybor is that the concepts, especially law and right, are supposed to be essentially ahistorical concepts that transcend the confines of discursivity to the point where they're transcendental ideals almost to the point of being a Platonic form. And as such, they're not genealogical because they could be said not to have a history of development per se, but are rather abstract ideals that are something to be aspired to rather than as lived realities.
So it's an ideal.
That's structure.
It's an ideal.
Essentially, I think that's how I understood it.
Right.
The question I have is, Dr. Goldberg, you mentioned critical inquiry. And I myself am an avid fan of critical inquiry and the school of the four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse and things of that nature. So in relation to one of their friends, Ayan Hirsi Ali, she wrote the book Infidel a number of years ago in 2004, and her most recent book is called Nomad. And I've been reading it recently. It came out in 2010, and I've been having a number of problems with it. Because ultimately it seems that she's whitewashing in both the literal and the figurative sense of making white Islamophobia to the point that these universal abstract enlightenment ideals are completely divested of their historical specificity in colonialism and racism and structures of sexism and gender inequality. And in a sense appropriating feminist discourse and turning it into an anti-feminist end by saying that Islam is essentially impossibly or inherently anti-democratic and cannot have its own cultural enlightenment, but rather has to divested itself of its own cultural history and essentially inherited Christian history. Because her proposal is that Muslims should be inspired to take on the Christian God as somehow a solution to their inherent need for some kind of theological dominance or something. But it's very problematic in my eyes. I don't know if either of you have read it, but the whole idea of this Enlightenment culture somehow being a universal, divested of racial specificity and a history of colonial dominance seems absolutely absurd. And I don't know how that can be proposed as a supposed solution to this clash of civilizations that she speaks of. And the notion of clash of civilizations is in itself dubious.
So the post and post-racial and post-colonial. I was in a way symptomatically trying to draw attention to the way in which they operate as figuring, what I call a kind of spirit life or shadow life, without drawing attention to itself, so to speak, by denying it even its possibility of its emanation. And so trying to point to there's been a good deal of literature dating back to the 1990s about the post in post-colonial. I mean, you think of a range of people from Anna Clintock and NYU. He's a friend that he's now forgotten. And so on, Anthony Appiah and so on and so forth. And very little on the post and post-racial, right? And just trying to point to the analogues between the two sets of conditions in terms of their temporalities marked by the conception of the post, and how the post operates in order to draw attention away from the very condition that they then reinscribe. Right? So, I mean, that was the point of that brief. And to try to open up a way of thinking about the postal, right, in this conception of things. And we need further elaboration in that regard. Regarding the Founding Fathers, and it's an interesting point, in the sense that I think points to the genealogical sort of formation of nation that immediately made me think of the conception of impregnation, precisely, right? That one draws on the notion of Founding Fathers as impregnating, right, the nation, impregnation, and the very notion of nativity.
It must be a bachelor's birth.
Absolutely, and indeed, yeah. I mean, a condition that
through the ear or something.
Yeah, which in a way requires the ratio in order to bear itself out, right? I mean, on both sides of that kind of racial inscription. So, I think an interesting, sort of connecting to Etienne's play on the notion of the genealogical, the engendering, the creation of family, of a national family, and so on and so forth in a variety of ways, that would bear again some considerable elaboration. I mean, Hirsi Ali, I just don't know why. I mean, I haven't read the recent book, although I've read a brief extract from it and a couple of reviews of it. But have watched her over 10 years. I spent a good deal of time in the Netherlands, where she spent a good deal of time. And I just don't know why we pay any attention to her. So, quite frankly, I mean, she must be absolutely squirming at the events of the past 3 or 4 weeks. I mean, there is no way she can, given the set of intellectual tools that she's given herself, there's no way that she can enable a comprehension.
Mr.
Ayan Hirsi Ali,
Oh, yes,
you know, the Somalian Dutch,
Yeah,
now the American Enterprise
Oh.
Institute.
the whole controversy, I guess she's published articles in English as well. But she's published an article in the French press right after the Egyptian.
I haven't seen anything. I mean, I haven't.
And of course, that's becoming an object.
Right. I mean, yeah, you know, but I think that's the point, that she's about creating controversy in order to keep a name in the spotlight, rather than adding in any, I think, you know, productive way to our understanding of events. And she's occupied a very, very problematic space, and in a way opened a space for somebody like Geert Wilders in the Dutch instance. You know, so I think she's been productive of producing the enablement of a set of, you might say, post-racial ideas in, you know, a society like the Netherlands, where her voice is very loud and made more possible because of the smallness of the space in every sense of the term. Whereas in the US, it seems to be drowned out by the Glenbecks and etc.
I just had a quick response. I think one of the things that I find most troubling about Ali, is that she is given some kind of insider credibility, and that she's taken kind of like the way Steele is by conservatives to be this exemplar of, look, they're saying this, we should be doing this, this is justifying.
She's a native voice.
Exactly.
If you allow me to jump quickly, just one phrase into that discussion, the thing I find troubling, I always found troubling in case of Ali. And in fact, I remember that started because the first time I saw the film that launched the whole history of submission, it was here in this very university where it was presented by, I guess, one of the departments here. Was it Women's Studies? I'm not sure. And I was stunned by the extent to which the film itself was in fact displaying a typical kind of Orientalist sexual racial stereotype. So she's produced the instrument or the object, that the visible object that then allows her to claim, not without, of course, absolutely without reasons, that there is an obscurantist, Islamist, misogynic politics under way. There's an element of deliberate provocation there, which is very strange. Okay, shall I try to say something? That would be very long. I will try and answer your question by taking a short circuit. But let me start with your direct question. In which sense did you refer to a notion of citizenship that would be anti-genealogical? Of course, this is linked to the idea that a certain emancipatory declaration of the rights of the citizen, on which many of our contemporary Republican nation states are based, is apparently at least delinking the individual from any sort of affiliation. I would use that term intentionally, another term whose etymology is interesting, of course. That would either qualify or disqualify him or her to be a citizen. Then, of course, everybody knows, I'd say, that things in practice are much more contradictory than that. And then all the problems which have to do with either denial, precisely, or covering, or ideological hypocrisy and so on, start coming in. I tend to believe that the notion of de-affiliation in a certain public sphere, at least, or as an institutional moment, must be taken seriously. But of course, it has counterparts, and it clearly calls. It has counterparts. It covers a hidden underground, which in fact is huge, extending from the family relations in the bourgeois society to the realities of the colonial world. So, bringing in the fact that there is in fact a topography that is inseparable from that discourse, and that its seemingly non-contradictory dimension or character can be upheld only at the coast, or with the condition that certain boundaries are tightly closed, and that the discourse doesn't cross from one place to another. Then, of course, the question arises of how to write the history of this contradiction and these separations, and how to understand not only their permanent effects, I would say, reproduction with different names of what can be always there, but also their transformations and the reasons why the conflict cannot be handled all the time in the same manner, which takes us in the end to what David was trying to describe today. So my very, very hesitant, much more than you might think, listening to my presentation, guiding thread, which, as I recall at the beginning, is largely the result. That's always, to me, and I'm sure to others also, extremely significant kind of experience, largely the result of reactions, transformations, critical transformations of some things I had said in the past. It will sound as an absolute banality, of course, is that we should not separate the issue of sexism and the issue of racism. They're absolutely indissoluble. They're not always taking the same form. I'm not saying that, but they're always indissoluble. So there are a number of genealogy or genealogical scheme is a name for that inseparability, as reproduction is in a different language. But then, of course, everything is open. So, and what I'm in a sense fascinated with is the fact that race is a very particular name for that connection. But it's also, in a sense, the most powerful and the most enduring name that we've had in the West, and as a consequence in the world. Hence, certain possibilities of going beyond the immediate appearances of racism without race, and so on. And in the end, my not my perplexity, but my interest for the fact that, well, the process has two sides. Racism without races, or even racism without racism. Racism is one side of the process. But then the fact that the names race, racism, etc., are omnipresent in our discourse, as they clearly are also in that neoliberal kind of discourse, you know, with the, of course, addition of all sorts of layers of performative reversals and contradictions, testifies for the fact that there is a sort of hardcore there which has to be, which we should keep analyzing. The final remark is, I was fascinated, no, this is not good. I was very interested by the way in which, towards the beginning of his talk, when sketching the framework of neoliberal discourse as a background for some of the cultural and discursive phenomena that he wanted to analyze. David recalled that the central tenet, the core idea of neoliberalism is the idea of the individual as entrepreneur. And then he referred to the well-known expression, of course, of the self-made man. Now take this literally, and try and draw and pull from there all the associations that come to mind. It says, in a sense, exactly that: de-affiliation, or even more strongly, interruption of the genealogical order. To return to formula that to the genealogical scheme. To return to formula that I had used. So I'm not totally sure of what I should do with that, but I'm becoming aware of the fact, first, that the interruptions are part of the story, of course, the way they're compensated for, the way they are covered, the way they are returned. What I should have said, of course, is that the legacy of slavery is not only the legacy of a traumatic interruption of the genealogical order, it's of course also the way of the creative invention of fictitious origins, collective origins. The one that is perhaps, of course, most striking being the idea that the slave trade itself, or the Atlantic Passage, is sort of origin for the collective identity of the black population. So you never stay with an interruption. But of course, depending on whether the interruption is taking place in the form of slavery, or is taking place in the form of the construction of the robotic neoliberal subject, this will not...
Can I just add one thing, because I think it does speak to you, and that is that there's a connection between this notion of the self-made man and the contemporary emphasis on the undoing of the common in the common good, or the public in the public good, right? So that the implication of this sort of make-believe of self-making is connected to the way in which you might call it a rupture or a set of interruptions, around what once held us together no longer does, right? And that notion of commonality is being disaggregated, being picked apart, being to various political purposes. And I think there's a deep relation between this conception of de-affiliation and the rupturing of the common.
Of course, I don't prevent you. Oh, sorry. Excuse me. Prevent you from throwing in something like, in spite of every universalistic discourse of citizenship, we won't get rid of the Oedipus complex. But it's part of the problem.
Could I ask this, please?
And then
I guess what I don't understand is how the genealogical is playing with the genealogical as family and as a family of ideas in the historical sense. I don't understand how it's helping what you're talking about, to be perfectly honest, because the anti-genealogical is itself a claim that
I'm trying to understand. You know, I'm thinking. I'm trying to figure out, with the help of that very general or generic formula itself, why, to put it like that, I mean, such institutions as the nation and the family are indissolubly linked. Their crises are linked. Their political vicissitudes are linked. It is not the case, for example, that the current crisis of the welfare state will deny that, will refute that. But the ways and forms of their combination are enigmatic, because they are not fixed. They're not fixed.
I want to pick up on a formulation that struck me as very pertinent that David used at one point, and if I got it right, it was like race as the spirit condition of the social. And that idea of the spirit condition of the social, I wanted you to perhaps elaborate a bit more of it in light of the two strands that came up in the discussion now. One is what Etienne brought up about genealogy and genealogical ruptures, but there's also a genealogy of haunting in your formulation, and the phantasmatic haunting. And I was struck how crucial, of course, in both your presentations, the role of fantasy was. Even in fantasy, racial, even in Etienne's, even though you didn't emphasize it as such, but many of your examples are actually grounded in racial fantasies. And then, of course, in light of the very fact that the very category of race was always constructed on highly sexualized fantasies. And perhaps we can, I really like that formulation, and I wonder if you want to elaborate from that perspective.
Yeah, well, race as a spirit condition of the social is, I draw on it in order to be able to give some account of the, not just the lingering, but the extension of the racial in the relative absence of its explicit terms of expression, right? And so, the social is both haunted by the set of expressionless expressions, right, to put it in that enigmatic word, as you suggest in Etienne's terms, repetitively interrupted, right? So there's both a kind of repetition to the sets of referentiality, And as is this repetition, there's also an interruption of any possibility of affiliative, more extensive and enlarged affiliative condition. And so it links to the, if a publicness or commonness is fashioned through sets of affiliation, as there must necessarily be of one kind or another, right? Those interruptions are then underpin the impossibility of again and again of getting any kind of commonality off the ground. Right? So, and at the same time, a spirit pervades, right? I mean, as spirits do. And in pervading, hints at other forms of affiliation that are not explicated, but are necessarily there, as a way of, at least implicitly, holding some together and excluding others. One thinks again here of District 9, who belongs to the human and who doesn't, for example, right? Are Nigerians part of us or aren't they? Oh, we recognize them because they save us to our humanness, and so on. So there's a way in which these ideas, I think, underpin the possibility of a lingering sociality, even in the face of its attack, or its dissolution.
I mean, it's very suggestive, the term as such also. I thought the term, the spirit condition of the social state. I thought about the one slide you brought with economy trumps race, where there's the white and the black Obama. I mean, you can really unpack it from the spectrums of Marx are there.
That's exactly what that came to my mind when listening to you, and that allows me, if you give me 1 minute for that, to return to your previous allusion to certain uses of the category of the transcendental. I don't think I'm flying into Platonic heaven of ideas, if only because I always use the term transcendental. I always use rather a term quasi-transcendental than transcendental, which I borrow precisely from Derrida and to some extent from Foucault, who also makes use of that. So in the case of Derrida, of course, the use is linked with two problematic notions. One is that conditions of possibility for the experience, which is the classical definition of the transcendental order, are always also conditions of impossibility for that same experience. So they bring in, of course, not only the normal, but also the abnormal or the exception. And second, there is the idea that the idea of spectrality, precisely, that is the enigmatic play of the visible and the invisible. And this has to do with the fact, in the case of race, that race is, and I'm not sure I can link that with genealogy, it's something else. It's rather a sort of phenomenology, is that I don't see any meaningful use of the category race or relations, references to racism and the racial. And we had, with David's talk, an extraordinary illustration of that, which are not continuously combining the bodily and the spiritual dimension in a sort of crystallized or concentrated paradoxical unity. So that's very interesting and also not completely here. Although I believe that in this field, literature, which I take in the broadest possible sense. So I would, of course, include Fanon, as I would include others, where the literary dimension is so meaningful, continuously speaks of that. What is it that is visible and what is it that is invisible? Who is it that is visible and who is it that is invisible in given companies, if I may say so. Last allusion, if you allow me, I was totally, absolutely stunned. First time that traces long ago, back long ago. That was much before we started talking and collaborating. When I, for the first time, received an invitation to come and teach a class at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, because the official motto of the university, which is reproduced, of course, on every official letterhead, is the following: Por tu raza habla el espíritu. Through your race, the spirit is speaking, which is amazing.
So unfortunately, we have to end now, but we wanted to thank both of our speakers for coming, and we wanted to thank all of you for coming, and please make sure that you check the website, as Adam said. We'll be updating it very soon, and we'll send out notices about the upcoming issue and the graduate student who's attached as editor to it. Thank you.